Hi, everybody. Good morning. It's Monday, and we're back with Data is Love. And today I'm really excited to have a conversation with my friend, colleague, fellow troublemaker, Uma Mishra, who's the founder of the Racial Equity Index. And so let's get started. And because I'm sick, I'm also going to do as little talking as possible and really turn the mic over to Uma. So hi, thank you for being here with me on a Monday morning. Will you just start off with telling us a little bit about yourself and like what your journey has been to getting to this point of creating this like really incredible tool?
Yeah, thank you so much, Aparna. And also, you're sick and you're still here. And so thank you for hosting this conversation. Um, my journey has been a very interesting, long, and diverse one. I spent 6 years in the U.S. Army as an active duty soldier. I then, was a medical lab tech in the civilian sector. Then I was an adjunct professor in chemistry and a high school teacher of chemistry and sciences and English. And then I joined the global development sector. And I started off as a volunteer and then started off as a volunteer in the women's rights space, and then became the director of global community of Women's March Global, and then transitioned to being the interim executive director and then the ED. And so all of that, and I say all of that because it's all of those experiences that have led me to what is now the Racial Equity Index and the work that I do with organizations and doing racial equity audits and organizational strategies and really having difficult conversations around racial violence in the global development sector. So all of those experiences have led me to that, and it's very much this combined kind of awareness of how and what it means to move through this world as a brown woman, and how what it means to move specifically through the global development space, having been a former executive director, having had those experiences of having to work with partners and funders and other EDs, and just bearing witness to all of the insidious, covert, racism that is embedded in this sector. And so all of those experiences have led me to what is now the Racial Equity Index, and this beautiful collective of 11 very strong BIPOC people that we have gathered together. We've been volunteers now for now nearly 2 years, and working to build what is now this accountability tool to hold the global development sector accountable for the continued racial violence against BIPOC people. And so we are demanding transparency, we're demanding accountability, we're demanding data on racial equity within organizations and within the sector at large. Yeah.
I feel like in every time we do Data is Love, there's always something that I want to put on a t-shirt, and we are demanding data. I'm like, can we get it on a t-shirt right now? We are demanding it. Before we go further, what is global development? Because I feel like a lot of our audience for Data is Love, tends to be people in tech and other startups. And so what is global development?
Yeah, a lot of people would classify the global development space as just like USAID and other aid organizations like that. But we have to remember, and again, this goes back to transparency and accountability. We need to really remember the history of global development. It's housed literally within upholding colonialism, and colonialism in itself was war. It was war against Black people, against South Asian people, against colonized countries. It was war, and it was a system of violence, whether it was the system of violence embedded in financial institutions, to educational institutions, to science institutions, to healthcare, right? All of these layers of violence in terms of what colonization was. global development was built to reify those systems and uphold those systems. And I say this because if you think about the whole white saviorism, that's embedded within global development, we're going to do good and we're going to help these impoverished countries. They're not impoverished countries. You impoverish them. You literally strip them of every resource and every capability, and now you're saying you're going to help them. So that is global development. It is a system of organizations, of consultancies, of private institutions, of funders, of donors that work to, I like to couch it as that work to try to repair the history and the legacy of colonization without even calling it that, and without even acknowledging that they are built upon that very, very rotten structure. Too much?
I mean, just hearing you say they aren't impoverished countries, like you and I are both from India, and a lot of times, when we talk about our home, people will say, well, that place is so unsafe for women, or that place is, it's so dirty, and how did it get there? Like it didn't, how did it get there, right? Like we're talking about places that were kind of like beacons of civilization a few hundred years ago. But hearing you say that also, has me thinking about the New York Times piece that recently came out on Haiti, and this expose on how when Black former enslaved people, fought to have their freedom, the French basically imposed upon them millions and millions of dollars in reparations, right? Which over the last couple hundred years is like totally stripped Haiti of the most basic resources, and on top of that, global development organizations, anytime there is a natural disaster in Haiti, they sweep in, they raise millions, and nothing ever changes. Nothing ever changes, right? Like these countries are kept in a cycle of poverty and lots of cultural violence. And how do we get past it? And I guess like when you all created the racial equity index, like what is the index measuring?
Yeah. I want to just comment though. It's like, how do we get past something we can't even acknowledge in this sector? We can't even acknowledge it. So we can't get past anything without even without basic acknowledgement of the fact that, if you look at what's been done to Haitian people and the country of Haiti, and the global development sector swooping in. A lot of people within global development would be like, well, what does it have to do with me as an organization or me as an executive director? Think about the fact that, your pay scales are not transparent, that you hire, consultants from Africa, not as salaried employees, as part of your organization that's based in London, in Geneva, in France, right? You hire them as consultants without benefits. That in itself is a reification of a harmful system, right? And so these are things that are so structured, they are designed, right? The design that organizations have has been built upon that structure. And so for us at the Racial Equity Index, we're a group of 11 people. We've been in the global development sector collectively over 50 years. And, we occupy all positions within global development, program officers to directors to, consultants. And we started this work because of the fact that when we look at data on racial equity in global development, it literally at that point 2 years ago was non-existent. There are a lot of gender equality indexes, that give organizations like a semi-gold star for being 50%, female led, but let's not also talk about the insidious racism of white women in global development. That's a discussion for another day, right? But what we wanted to do was really to work to build a research-based method and a peer-reviewed method. Also, let's talk about why we have to be peer-reviewed, because our work, again, as BIPOC people is over-scrutinized. So we have built this research method to be able to now produce, and we're working on producing the final kind of survey that will go out to organizations in the sector at large to provide literally a snapshot of where organizations are in their racial equity purported journeys or not, and where the sector is. And it's the survey that we're building is based on the preceding 2 years of research, based on the global mapping survey that we sent out very early last year. We spent the entirety of last year researching and doing the qualitative and quantitative data analysis. Again, all as volunteers, and that data, that we really unpacked was it was interesting. When I say it was interesting, it was heavy, right? If you look at the fact that a predominant number of people that answered our survey, and again, it was a survey on racial equity, 32% of them were white women, right? The survey was really targeting, BIPOC people in the sector. And so there's a correlation with what we found in this global mapping survey and what is actually the reality within the global development sector. And so we're using all of this data to really now inform the questions that we are going to be putting forth to organizations in the sector at large.
I feel like I've read different parts of the report over the last, I think, almost 2 years that we've known each other. And every time I read a snippet or, you've done another round of analysis, I'm both surprised and not surprised by what you're learning and how consistent the experiences are, in particular of people of color, regardless of where they are in the world. It isn't that like there are people of color having experiences in, predominantly white, high income countries in the global north. It's also the experiences of Black and Brown people in the global South. And so I don't want us to skip over what you said about the insidious racism of white women in global development, because they are the majority of decision makers. They are also the majority of funders. And a few weeks ago, maybe about a month ago, we had two very cool women, major troublemakers on Data is Love, Sarah Rao and Regina Jackson, who have written a book and also came out with a documentary that's called Deconstructing Karen. And they were talking about the fact that no US distributor had picked up their film right here in the US, right? So as they were looking to launch their documentary, the film festival that picked it up was Hot Docs, which is a Toronto-based Canadian film festival, because literally nobody in the US would pick it up because it was too provocative, it was too radical, it was, too disruptive. And so I'm curious, like, what has your experience been as a group of BIPOC folks disrupting the global development sector in raising money and scaling your work?
A lot of people ask us this question, and they frame it as, well, are you not fundraising? No, we've been actively fundraising since we started this work. We've been actively fundraising. I've spoken to many funders, and used every ounce of my own personal network to be able to connect with as many funders as possible within the United States and also in the UK and the EU. And it is phenomenal, the response that we get, which is, this is so critical, this is overdue, this is urgent work, but we would really like to just see where you are in the next year. Or another response is, if you can get one funder, then we'll come along. And these standard responses, right? Or another response is, this is really critical work, but what about, these other organizations that are white led that have done some research on this? Are you going to be partnering with them? Are you going to be, working with them? Let's be really clear, and let's just say what it is. We are a group of BIPOC people that are very intentional in our approach. We are not going to succumb to the demands of what a grant will require us to do, which is to either, one funder was like, we want you only to focus on the US and not, global development at large. But the reality is the US isn't an island. The US global development sector has impacts, and really negative impacts across the world. So we can't ignore that, right? So for us as a group, we are incredibly intentional about who we will partner with in this work, because we also know that funders themselves, one of the issue areas that we talk about within our indicators is funding, right? And how funders tend to dictate program outputs and what they think should be, where our focus area should lie. What we come back to again and again as a collective is we are 11 BIPOC people that have all experienced racism in global development. I will be very blunt. White people have no racial agility, have no somatic experience of what racism feels like, right? This is not just something that happens. This is something that keeps on happening and keeps on happening and keeps on happening. And the layers and the weight of racial violence within global development, whether it's in HR management, whether it's in leadership, whether it's in workplace culture, whether it's in working with partners, right, who use coded language, the layers and the weight of those experiences, we have to move through them every single day. So this work of building an accountability index, an accountability tool, and working for justice can't be done by white folks because they do not have the experience, they do not have the lived experience. And it's interesting because funders will be like, we want to fund people who are doing the work who have lived experience. That's it, we're here. Hi, but we're too radical.
Yeah, we're too radical and we're too scary. And yeah, I mean, as you're talking about this, it's bringing up for me a lot of the work I've done supporting global development on the foundation side. And, when you look at data, right, because we're demanding it, when you look at data, what I think is often true is that the majority of funding is still going to white-led organizations in predominantly high-income countries that are then piecemealing the work out to Black and brown people in the global South, paying them pennies and writing them out of major publications, writing them out of, the accolades and the awards. And it happens in the name of corruption. Right, there's a lot of corruption in the global South, and so we wouldn't, directly give funds to an organization on the ground because we don't know where that money is going to go. Meanwhile, some faculty member at the University of North Carolina gets to bill a foundation like $250,000 as 10% of their take-home pay, as if their salary is $2.5 million, right? Like it is not. Right. Yeah. Have you seen any examples of global development work that is taking into consideration the racialized nature of our existence, right? Like the fact that colonization and its impacts can continue to reverberate in like our daily lives. I mean, the Queen literally had her like 75th like Jubilee situation. And it's literally only in the last 75 years that Britain's colonies have split from her, right? And we're still all called Commonwealth countries.
Right.
Yeah. Who's doing it well?
Who's doing it? I would say the groups that are being led by BIPOC people. So Black Feminist Fund, right, which has their funding call out right now. Their intentionality, their approach, their commitment to their funding approach is what is needed, right? But it's a group that's intentional and led by Black women, right?
Yeah.
Frida as well. Like there are funders out there that are doing good work. From an organizational level, it's harder for me to answer that question because I'm a consultant and I consult with organizations who are like, we really want to be better on racial equity, and then they bring me or a colleague of mine in, and they're like, we want to focus on racial equity, but can we broaden the scope a little bit? This is a little bit too scary. And you've talked about this a tremendous amount. When we talk about DEI, literally this is the first step in making white people comfortable to even talking and uttering the word race, right, in an organization, right? So this is the work within the organizational side of things within global development. We still have such a long way to go, such a long way to go. And again, because there is no data on racial equity in global development, we have pledges. We have lots of pledges that are like, we pledge to do better on racial, but we don't have data, right? So because we don't have that data, we can't actually call for any form of accountability because it's all abstract right now, right? And organizations can say, well, we did a racial equity audit and here's where we've seen advances. Well, the advance we want to see is, has there been a shift of power? And if you can't answer that question, then there hasn't been a shift of power and you actually aren't progressing.
What kind of data would you like organizations to share publicly?
Yeah, I want to know, not just what your board makeup is and if you have BIPOC people on your board, but does your board actually hold the organization accountable, in terms of racial equity and anti-racism work? Is your pay structures, are they transparent? Do you actually for consultants, for full-time consultants that are part of your so-called staff, are you paying them benefits? Are you charging them fees because they happen to live in another country and the currency conversion, like they have to swallow that? Do they actually get support in terms of, are they seen in the same way as staff within your organization? Do the white leaders in your organization, do they know what racism is? Can they talk about anti-racism? Or are they just like, we need to look beyond race and we need to be also things that I've heard, as a consultant. So I want to know all of those pieces of data. I want to know, even within our 11 indicators, where are you receiving funding from? Are you receiving funds from organizations that continue to do harm to people within the world at large? Are you, with your partners, are you actually reifying harmful subgranting practices, or are you actually disrupting that way of existing within global development? Is your HR structure actually equitable, or is it run by people or a system that harms people? Are there safeguarding principles in place? Is there a clear chain of, like, if a situation of racism happens in your organization, which it probably does, and you just don't talk about it, is there a way for employees to come forward without facing reprisal, without actually risking themselves to be fired because they came forward?
Yeah, and for all of that to be public so that we're not guessing. And I think that there's such parallels between, the work that you're doing with the Racial Equity Index and seeking transparency with global development organizations, both, funders and folks on the ground. And I think what we're seeing in a lot of worker-led movements for accountability around similar things, even outside that sector, right? Like, people want to know pay equity and pay transparency. Is that happening? What is the way to escalate issues when they come up? Or do you just fire people? Or do you let them go? Do you, what is it like when your role comes to a close? All of these little loopholes, rather than to deal with it.
I want to just add, the thing is, the reason why we have our call is for data transparency and for accountability and justice is because data is power, right? When we don't know, we can't actually do anything about, the situation. Everything will remain abstract. That is a tool of white supremacy. Let's be really clear, right? White supremacy wants to keep everything in the fog, wants to keep everything abstract, because when we know the data, we would all be up in arms of like, this is not okay, right? Data is power, as you say, in so many ways. Data is power. And for us, the people within the global development sector, the white folks in global development, have that control right now. and that, it's not equitable. And so for us, we are really calling on that transparency so that everyone can be very, very clear on the state of racial equity in global development, which, to be honest, is not great.
Yeah, it's bringing up for me, I think, a conversation that I had with somebody maybe 10 years ago at the Gates Foundation that was working on malaria. And this is, I think, before they'd had some major breakthroughs. And they were talking about all of the funding that was going to nets and medication. And, like having grown up in a country where, like, of course you get malaria because there's always stagnant water because we don't have covered sewer lines. I was like, well, why are you funding nets? Like, the problem is stagnant water, right? The mosquito likes to hang out there. All the nets in the world are going to help you solve malaria. And this person looked at me like, well, you're being really negative, right? They said to me, I was being really negative, and how hard they were trying to work. And I was like, as somebody who's had malaria as a result of stagnant water, and the mosquitoes that love to live in it, I don't know. I mean, it's like, it's not you. What are you doing? And I feel like I keep having these experiences with folks that are in the global development sector that are trying to solve these big, meaty problems, but they're not actually talking to people on the ground, and they don't actually have the lived experiences of many of the things that they're solving for, right? And I think what you said is so on point. Everything is abstract.
Yeah.
This is an abstract, theoretical problem for people to solve. Nutrition, abstract problem. Malaria, abstract problem, right? You haven't been impacted by it. You haven't spent typically any real amount of time in countries where people are experiencing the bulk of those issues. And so for you, it's like being a weekend baker.
Mm-hmm.
You don't bake for a living. Mm-hmm. You occasionally make a pie.
Right.
And so we can take all the time in the world. Like,
it's not urgent.
Play around.
Yeah.
It's not urgent.
Not urgent. Yeah. But
it's
not urgent for a majority of people within the sector, but for BIPOC people who continue to have to literally show up to work every single day, and also, move through every level of racial violence that this sector holds for us, it's exhausting. And as we were just talking about this as a collective in our working group call last week, we are exhausted. Mm-hmm. Remember that as we're doing this research, as we're literally reading these qualitative answers on people's experiences of racism and witnessing racism in global development, that too causes mental fatigue. That too takes a toll. What we're doing is not easy work, right? This is also why white folks can't do it, because they have no somatic knowledge. They have no knowledge of how racism houses itself in the body, in the human body, in our psyches. They have no knowledge of that. So you can't tell me that then a group of BIPOC people that is doing this work that has lived experiences somehow not even more valuable, right? It's just, I am always at a loss for words when I think about the pledges that are out there and the groups that are doing this work that are white-led, that have received funding, and the gender equality indexes that are now all of a sudden including racial equity because it's the hot topic, right? And the numerous DEI consultants that are out there that have no like foundation in racial equity or anti-racism, right? And they themselves are reifying very harmful approaches to DEI. Yeah. Who else is exhausted?
I mean, I am, obviously. I feel like we can do a whole other conversation about DEI consultants that don't use data, right? We don't need any quantifiable information. We can just have really big, broad, abstract conversations. Right. Before we close out, I have two questions for you. How much money does the racial equity index need to grow, right? To become a staple tool accountability mechanism? And the second is, how else can we support you?
Yeah. So the racial equity index for us, we're looking for 3 to 5 million over the next 3 to 5 years, right? And so that will allow us to help remunerate the people that are doing this work, hire more, data scientists, and people that will allow us to really build this index in the way that we need it. Because of our limited capacity, we've had to circumvent a few of the key things that we've wanted to do because we want to get this tool out there. And so that's really what we're looking for. And in terms of, like where we're headed in this work, we are hoping that, I don't want to speak for the rest of the collective, that by the end of this year that we have a tool that's out there. But people can learn more and people can support in a lot of different ways. We have a Patreon. We've got our upcoming anniversary event that's coming up on the 25th of June. And it's a bit truncated because we're all really tired. It's just one day, but you can learn more about our work. And then when this tool comes out, spread it through your organization. If you are working in global development, and if you also face if you actually fear the risk of reprisal within an organization, then take it as an individual, right? We want this tool to be accessible to as many people as possible with our limited capacity right now. And so we would love for people to just share and spread knowledge of our work as we continue to do it. And also, if you are a funder and if you have connection to funders, don't be shy. I'm on LinkedIn, and and the rest of our collective is on LinkedIn. So please connect with us and share the love.
Okay, connect folks to funders. A cool meal a year. I feel like that shouldn't be.
It's not a stretch. It's not
we spend so much money. Companies spending $8 billion a year on DEI.
There you go.
$8 billion. What is $1 million? Right?
Especially with all of the purported pledges to racial equity in global development, and all of the purported funding to racial equity in global development. Yeah.
Okay, connect with you and your team. And there are some rad folks on your team. They're so smart. Okay, and use the tool. Submit responses to your survey when it comes out. So those three things, we're going to keep talking about it because this needs to exist, obviously. And I want to thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you for
being here.
No, for always supporting, and for your sisterhood in this work, and for your presence in this sector and what you do. Thank you, Aparna.
All right. We're going to be back next week. And in the meantime, have a great week ahead, folks. Thank you. Thanks, everybody.
Bye.
Bye.